warm good evening to all. I, Ramanathan, on behalf of IIT Madras, welcome you all to this. On this juncture, where we are losing human touch in the areas ranging from music to teaching, the impact created on the lives of humans by activities increases leaps and bounds when equipped with technology. Technology without ethics and empathy will not be useful for humans and the environment. On the other side, ethics and empathy without technology will not be able to serve a huge population. The impact that the minds of IIT can create by developing technology under the bounds of ethics and empathy will be phenomenal. How to get the right mix of ethics, empathy and technology? We need experts who can get the right mix. Today, we have with us one such expert, the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshini Rinpoche. Mr. Tenzin Priyadarshini is the founder and CEO of Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT and Director of Ethics Initiative at the MIT Media Lab and Director's Fellow there. He is also a Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Mr. Tenzin is member of the MIT Board of Chaplains and also serves as the Buddhist chaplain to the Institute. He is also the founding director and president of the Prajnopaya Institute and Foundation, a worldwide humanitarian organization. He works on projects that promote humanitarian aid and cultural understanding in countries such as India, Nepal and Japan to benefit the disadvantaged population of the countries. May I now invite our distinguished speaker for the evening, the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshini Rinpoche, to deliver his much anticipated talk on ethics, empathy and technology. Over to you, sir.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, great. Good afternoon. We'll keep it very informal. I'm on my way to the airport. That's why I'm here with my bags. It's a delight to be here this afternoon. And I think with a group like this, I'm more interested in how you're thinking about technology and its advancements. So maybe I'll just share a few thoughts for a few minutes, and then maybe we can just have a conversation or a dialogue as to what are you thinking and how are you framing your own journeys around this thing. So one of the key things that I've been pushing for is around the idea of ethics as optimization, and the idea being basically that for the longest time, at least in the last 20 and 30 years, much of our focus when we design technology has been around optimization for efficiency. You know, how to make things faster, how to make things bigger, how to scale things up better. And we have reached a scale where, you know, it's when you do something at 10x speed, it's nice. When you do it at 100x speed, it's very nice. But then when you do it at a 200x speed, it's okay. I mean, because even the evolutionary part of that adaptation doesn't make it very new in terms of innovation sort of things. But then the idea becomes is that can we optimize it for something else, and are we also studying the behavioral impact that such technologies do to the fabric of civic society? So for example, you take the advent of internet, and the founders of internet, when they designed internet and when they deployed it, they were very optimist. We sort of came from a culture of techno-optimism. And the founders of internet were very happy with the idea that finally we have a technology that is going to dissolve barriers, it's going to allow people to share information freely, it's going to democratize access to data, and it's going to solve, you know, some of the major challenges that we have been facing as humanity in terms of access to education, healthcare, things of that nature. Now, internet did some wonderful things, you know. It connected us all. It did democratize some aspect of information sharing. It revolutionized the way we do business in terms of e-commerce and things of that nature. But then again, social media. And with social media, again, the whole idea was that, oh, it's going to increase connectivity, It's going to help with sharing. People are going to understand each other better. The planet is going to get smaller and smaller as far as human understanding is concerned. And so many of the companies that were designing algorithms for social media groups kept thinking along those lines of just sheer optimism, that this is what it's going to do. But then a few years ago, when we started looking at some of the behavioral aspects of what these things were doing, it concerned us. It concerned us in the manner that, why is it that this platform that is designed to connect people is actually priming them to become more tribal in nature? Okay? So for example, evolutionary, we all know that we have certain sense of tribalism built in us. But what social media did is that it put tribalism on steroids. It digitized the whole movement. And as you have heard, in the elections in the United States and other places, even in India, that we are looking at impact of social media and so on, that it created a very divisive conversation. It created a lot of different sort of groups, some operating out of anonymity, some operating as who they are, but creating sort of very uncivil conversation in society. And so just a couple of months ago, we were having a meeting with some of these founders of internet, and I raised the question that if it was up to you, what would you do with internet today? And one of them said, we should just shut it down. And the other guy said, we should create something called Internet 2.0, which is that we build it with some different kind of framing in mind so that we are constantly thinking about how it's impacting human behavior. The reason being this, which is that when you design technology for comfort and so on, but it reaches a stage where you begin to question that some of the institutions, some of the civic institutions that we have struggled to design, will it stand this advent in technology? So for example, can our democracy survive internet? Right? It's an institution that is dear to us. We have worked very hard to create some form of civic discourse, some kind of process in how we elect political leaders and so on. But when you start having certain behavioral nudgings at a certain scale by using social media, by using internet, how funds are being injected, how funds are being transacted in these kinds of things, you begin to start asking that, is it worth it? Is it worth for technology to sort of undermine some of these civic institutions, or will it create further chaos in society? So these are some of the kinds of conversations that is happening. I'm sure most of you are aware of the challenge that happened with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook a couple of years ago. And it's not that people did not know that it was going to happen. When you look at the algorithm design, there are all kinds of inclination that it is actually fueling tribalism. It is fueling certain kind of challenges in that. The second aspect of it is the unintended consequences of some of these sort of mass-consumed platforms. How many of you have heard of online blues syndrome? How many of you are social media users? How many of you are on Facebook? Okay. So, you know this thing when you get on Facebook, you're super excited, and you suddenly discover you have 3,000 very close friends, right? And these 3,000 very close friends are posting the best things that are happening in their life, right? So they're posting their social gatherings, the parties they're attending, the highlights of their event. And every morning or afternoon or however often you check Facebook and so on, you look at it and you're sort of passively thinking, oh, all of my friends are having a wonderful time except for me. Right? Like, look at them, they are visiting these places, they are meeting with these people and so on. And then, you go to a gathering or you have certain highlight in your life that you think is wonderful, and so you take a picture and you post it. And then you're checking every 10 minutes how many people have liked it. And 20 minutes go by, nobody has liked it. You begin to question all 3,000 of your friends, right? Meaning that, you know, are things that are happening in my life not that important that people are not concerned about it? Yeah. 30 minutes go by, nobody has liked it. You begin to have self-doubt. You begin to start thinking, maybe this is not the right picture. Maybe I should delete this. Maybe I should delete this post. Maybe I should edit it in some way so I can gain more traction. Now, the whole idea of thumbs up as an algorithm is designed to fulfill this desire for human validation. I mean, it's pure psychology, you know, transformed into how we think about validation algorithms. Right? But what happens over the months or years that you're using this thing, you're not thinking of it consciously, but what's happening is that it's increasing your proximity with depression, hence the online blues syndrome, right? Meaning that it's not a full-blown episode of depression. Well, it's having a cumulative impact where you're constantly giving rise to this sense of self-doubt. You're constantly giving rise to things, is it worth it, is it not worth it? And the sense of constant comparison with how others are having a wonderful time and how you're not having such a great time in your life. Right? Now, when you look at, again, the impact on civic society over a period of time, it's hard to say, you know, whether the technology itself will help correct that behavior, will actually help correct that mindset or not. So these are some of the unintended consequences for when we design certain things and not take into account the ethical framing of it and the empathy aspect of it. So empathy aspect implying, again, that, you know, the optimist idea is it's going to connect everybody. There are 5 billion users. Suddenly the planet will become smaller. But then at the same time, you look at the world and loneliness is an epidemic in most developed societies. Right? So you ask the question that, you know, this doesn't gel very well, that we have so many modes of communication, so many platforms that bring people together. Why is it that people are feeling alone? Why is it that people are feeling lonely? So these are some of the challenges where we begin to see that how empathy, you see, is getting actually discounted, it is getting minimized in the process of design itself. Now, traditionally, the way we have designed technology has been in a manner that we think of a problem, or we think of, if you're entrepreneurial, you design a problem, and then you think of a solution that you can market to a given market. And we design things, then we deploy it, and after a couple of months or years of deployment, you realize that there are some challenges with the product, and then you have legal bodies and regulatory bodies telling you what the problem is. So you have product recalls, or you decide to pay the legal fees and things of that nature. But what's happening is that after deployment of product, it's only then that you're looking into the compliance framework of things. And it's always about the legal framing, whether it has to do with data privacy issues, whether it has to do with Volkswagen recalls. It's always about the compliance part. So most of us, when we are designing products, we are not even thinking in terms of the overall long-term impact in different facets. Ethics is not in the equation. Compliance is, meaning that whether the product is compliant with the regulatory mechanisms of a given market. But one of the things that some tech venture companies now are thinking about is that what if we brought ethics in the design process itself? Meaning that if you had ethicists or some framing around ethics at the core of design process, what kind of product it will determine, what kind of product will it help create. So those are sort of two of the efforts that I'm trying, and much of our work is trying to do, which is that looking into injecting ethics and empathy at the very inception of design process and then trying to carry it through. And again, it's very different from the compliance or the regulatory framework. It is more sort of looking into what are the possible outcomes of deployments of such technology. And the reason being, again, slightly this, which is that historically we have romanticized the idea of learning from mistakes. Right? We say that often to ourselves, that we learn from mistakes. And learning from mistakes is a nice idea, and it's a nice thing to do when you're operating as individuals or small organizations. Right? But with the advent of certain scale-up technologies in machine learning and artificial intelligence, when you realize that the scale of mistake could be so huge, that the scale of mistake could be so massive, one has to recognize that learning from mistake would probably not work very well, because that mistake will be just too costly, too expensive. And at times, the demand that it's going to pose on the system, the stress that it's going to pose on the system, might actually create certain kinds of breakdowns in the system. So this idea that we learn in the aftermath of making mistake, in certain sectors of technology becomes a rather expensive lesson. Let me give you an example, like judicial systems. Right? So judicial systems in most countries are a rather ineffective process. Right? So if you look at Indian judicial system, there are cases that are lagging behind for 20 years, 30 years, and so on. Right? And it's true, the demand is too much, the stress on the system is too much. Not enough judges, not enough hours in the day to process the cases. So of course, it's a problem. If you bring engineers to solve the problem, they start looking into how do you design efficient systems. So similarly, there was a group in the United States that decided that let's create an AI-based platform that allows judges to simply assign certain kinds of scores, you see, to individuals, based on, of course, the historical data that we have. And by assigning scores, the system goes through its algorithm, does certain calculation, and it'll give some recommendation to judges that, you know, whether this person should get a bail or not, whether this person should go to parole or not. You know. People were excited. You know, it's a system that would promise efficiency. It's a system also that promises fairness to some degree. You know. But then it turned out that most of the data sets that these systems were trained on were historical data sets. Historical data sets are heavily biased data sets. So they were heavily biased towards certain demographics, meaning that people of color, African Americans, Hispanics and all, that if you put scores historically based, then they were going to be disadvantaged, you know, to begin with. Now the challenge is, what's happening in this scenario is that you're taking an institutional problem, but you're layering it with a certain aspect of technology that creates efficiency, but it also deepens the problem. Right? And it deepens the problem to the degree that even judges become sometimes detached. Remember the time when, you know, when we launched certain computer systems in India, and people will say, you know, sorry, the computer won't let me do it. Right? Meaning that what we learn to do is we learn to transfer our sense of responsibility to the system. We say, well, the system is more objective and probably can decide for me. And so imagine where, you know, the judges even have the intuition that probably the case is not as clear-cut, or this person deserves bail, or this person deserves a more lenient sentencing. But the system informs them that no, based on the score of these criminal cases, this person should get 10 years in prison, or 5 years in prison, or $1 million bond or bail, and so on. So what happens is, then, in the guise of technology, we further sort of institutionalize these kinds of discriminatory problems. But there's a tremendous demand from judicial system all over the world to try to adopt these kinds of technologies. Right? But the issue again becomes is, what are the kinds of data sets that you are developing it on? We started finding challenges with even things like facial recognition AI systems. Couldn't differentiate between a gorilla and an African American. And when you refined it further, it couldn't differentiate between two African Americans. Or sometimes it wouldn't even recognize a dark-skinned face. So you start asking yourself that if you're going to use these kinds of technologies in legal systems and policing systems and airports and so on, one is what kind of messaging we are sending, but how we are institutionalizing certain kinds of biases. So again, this is something where the ethics and empathy framework becomes very important in how we integrate certain algorithms to be able to refine it and make it better in a certain way. In certain cases, it becomes much more vivid issues, much more vivid challenges. So one case is the self-driving car. So I'll give you two examples of that. So one of my colleagues at Media Lab did a massive study collecting about 40 million, I think, data points from users on how a self-driving car should make certain kinds of decisions. Because we were talking earlier with some of the students around policy, on technology policy and so on. And that's where the policy part doesn't become that easy to design. And as you will imagine that most people, when it comes to certain kind of decision making, they make very utilitarian decisions, right? So it's like the car is going at a certain speed and it has to make a sudden swerve either to the right or left. On the right, if you go, you hit one person. If you take a left, you hit 5 people. Which way will you turn the car around, right? So people say, okay, I'll hit the car. I'll take the car to the right and hit one person by saving 5 lives, right? So you create many complex scenarios this way. You know, there's a pregnant woman and a child, and there's one guy. Which way would you serve the car? And you know, unless you hate pregnancy, you swerve to the right, and you hit again one guy by saving 3 lives, right? So people make different kinds of responses in terms of how the choice is going to be made. Then there was a scenario where it was that the car could hit 5 people, or the car could self-destruct by killing the owner of the car. So you're in the self-driving car. The car is going at, you know, a wonderful high speed or whatever speed, and you know you're enjoying watching a film in a 4-hour car drive, and suddenly it has to make an abrupt stop. It'll hit 5 people, or it can self-destruct by killing the owner. So most people said, yes, the car should self-destruct because they're still thinking about utilitarian decisions. So, yes, the car should self-destruct by killing the owner. However, I will not buy that car, but other people should. Okay? So here you have a dilemma where you're trying to put self-driving cars on the streets. How do you create a public policy around it? How do you create an insurance policy around it? Who becomes responsible? Is it the software designers? Is it the hardware designers? Who become responsible at the end when we take this sort of chain of causation around responsibility and agency? Sometimes things are not that simple because we even make decisions differently, culturally speaking. So I was advising a group in Japan, a Japanese automotive company around this. And the scenario was that there is a self-driving car. On the right side, there's a guy on a motorcycle, on a motorbike, wearing a helmet. On the left side, there's a guy also on a motorcycle without a helmet, not wearing a helmet. And you're put in this one of these scenarios where the car has to either take a right or a left. Which way will you drive the car? Because again, if you're looking at binary decision making, it will be easier to design an algorithm on that. Now, if you run that scenario in the United States, Germany or other places, people will say the car should swerve to the right, hitting the guy who's riding the motorcycle with a helmet on because he has protection. He has helmet on, so chances are that rider is going to have minimal amount of damage. But when you run the scenario in Asian countries, most people say, no, the car should go on the left because the guy was already breaking the rule. Okay? He wasn't wearing the helmet, he was breaking the rule. Why should you punish the guy who's following the rule? Okay? So now, again, it becomes a challenge that how do you design ethical norms and how do you design algorithm based on those norms because the culture plays an important role. In the European Union, there was this case around age issues, like the car is going at a certain speed and it needs to take a turn or it needs to hit somebody because there's no other option. People were proposing that the sensors should basically sense which person is older in age, and the car should swerve that way because the younger person probably has more potential. Right? So the entire EU sort of went up in arms. No, this is ageism, this is discrimination, and so on. So finally, they came to the idea, no, the car should go straight, and we leave it to chance. That whoever gets is left on chance. Now, you can imagine that we are designing these technologies. These technologies will be consumed by billions of users. It will have massive impact on civic society, both in terms of the administration of it and how do we design things. And some of these technologies will be in the market, some are already in the market, some will be in the market in the next 2 to 3 years. The question becomes is that if we don't give serious consideration to the ethical and empathy framework, then chances are that we'll be making a lot of huge mistakes. Okay? Meaning that just imagine how long it took us to get to democracy as a civilization. Right? Now imagine suddenly next day you wake up and you realize that there are systems that looked very wonderful, but now your democracy is in jeopardy. Right? The cost is huge. You begin to start thinking, well, which other form of governance do we work with now? Or how do we tweak the process with which we elect individuals? So these are some of the things that we are discussing. At the same time, there are a lot of course, positive aspects, again, with the advent of these things. Some are, around the idea of how it might personalize delivery of education, how it might personalize delivery of healthcare, and so on. And again, those are the places where I think we need to start thinking more deeply about these kinds of issues. So maybe I'll just take a pause here and just open it up for conversations and see how you guys are thinking about these things. I mean, I could go on. I have gazillions of examples, but I don't want to just bore you with all that.
Good evening. I have I don't know if it's a good question or what. What I think is that you're talking about it in terms of new technology and internet and the modern day, but there have been things that we've done as human beings for a very long time: agriculture, industrial revolution. I'm a chemical engineer, so every chemical plant. I don't know if we've reflected on this. I can't imagine we haven't, but we've made a number of decisions that, I don't know if they're ethical towards one set of people in a sense. So are we, is this something brand new, or is this something that there's already been some thought and now we're trying to modify it for new technology that's coming up? I'm not sure.
So, I mean, the conversation around ethics is not new. The issue about how relevant ethics has been at different points in any society, that's something to be looked at. Meaning that, there's a lot of noise around ethics, right? As a society, we like to think about ethics. We like to think that we are ethical people, right? But if you look at the manifestation of ethics in civic society, it's negligible. Right? It's negligible in the sense that, we don't spend enough time training people in ethical imagination. We spend time training them in certain kinds of skill sets that we recognize is going to be useful, either for the purposes of employment or for the purposes of discovery or anything of that nature. But ethics is something that we just think that it's going to be magical. Either people are going to get it from their family randomly because we believe that somehow parents are going to be ethical people, right? Or we simply presume that people are going to learn. Right? And that's the issue, that the cost of unethical decisions has a huge impact on civic society. Right? And when we talk about complex organizations and complex societies, we have to start thinking about how would it impact. So take an example, 2008, 2009, financial meltdown, right? People will give you all kinds of reasons for why it happened, right? But at the core of it, why it happened was human greed. That's the NDC, right? Was it an expensive mistake to make? Yes. Some countries are still trying to recover from it. Okay? It's been 10 years almost. Did it have negative impact on society? Yes. People lost homes, people lost savings, people died in doing that. So at that moment, you come to recognize that it's not just unethical decisions in silos. It's individuals who are in decision-making power, who are making these kinds of choices. So then we start as society to just blame them and say, oh, they are unethical people. Right? the question becomes is, well, in civic society, what are the avenues where we actually encourage people to learn about ethics? Right? School systems don't have conversations around ethics. Universities have the most boring classes on ethics. If you actually take a sample of undergraduates who have taken any version of Ethics 101 and so on, and after they graduate after 3 years, 4 years or whatnot, if you look at the retention level of what they actually learned in the classroom, it's minimal. Okay? The other aspect of it becomes its relevancy. We teach history of ethics, we teach sociology of ethics, but we don't actually push hard on how do you translate ethics into behavioral changes among individuals. So the issue is that if kids are not going to learn about it in schools and in universities, when should they learn about it? Because these are the individuals who are going to be managing our money. They'll be the bankers. These are the people who will be policymakers. These are the people who are going to lead political systems. So the challenge becomes here that as a system, the cost is humongous. Right? So it's not about whether ethics has been part of a civic discussion or not. The issue is how relevant it becomes now. Maybe, yeah.
Hello, hi. Professor Preeti, I think she was trying to communicate, so the technology and the examples, whatever it gave, it talks about artificial intelligence, it talks about latest technologies. But then as humankind, we have been using technology in, historically, in a lot of unethical ways. So when she quotes about chemical engineering and...
Okay, got it. So to that point, the thing is that you have to look at the evolutionary cycle also of deployment of certain kinds of technologies, right? So if you look at deployment, so for example, genetically modified crops, right? We have been doing it for time immemorial, right? Now, but there has been an evolution cycle in that, meaning that as humans, we had time to adapt to some of these deployments, whether it was done by nature or whether it was done through us. So that has been the other challenge, is that now the introduction and deployment of technologies are happening so fast and at such a scale that it's very difficult for us to even assess what the impact is going to be, because we actually don't have the life cycle of adaptation that fast. Meaning, human brain has only certain capacity to adapt to technologies in certain ways. Right? But when you look at certain kind of behavioral assessments, you begin to wonder what's going on, but you don't know, what the overall impact is going to be. Right? That's where the challenge is, that it's happening at a much faster pace than I think if you look at historically when it happened.
Hello, sir. My question is I'm all for ethics being a part of the development stage of products, but like the question, like when you quoted the examples, like whether we should go left or whether we should go right, whether we should kill the person who is wearing a helmet or whether we should kill the person who is not wearing a helmet. But like these questions have been from the times of Aristotle, and so these have not been answered till today, and I don't see any reason that these questions will be answered in the near future also. Like I don't know whether these questions will be ever answered, because they are so complex, and since these are the questions which are stalling the development of products, like I don't see the government of India approving self-driving cars unless we answer such kind of critical questions. But it is a fact that driverless cars have reduced the number of accidents many-fold less. So isn't it? Is it not a ethical paradox, if I may say, that we are allowing more number of accidents to happen if we are not allowing driverless cars, but we are stalling where that only because we are not able to answer this question.
Right. So that's a very good point. So the thing is, again, when we talk about ethical framing of designing certain kinds of products, the answer is, the issue is not whether you have a straight binary response to these things. whether you have solved the problem or not. The reason I'm even bringing these problems up as simply as matters of illustration is because these are design problems. Right? Now, the idea is not that whether we are going to solve these problems or not. You see? But the issue does become is that it creates certain levels of filtering, and it's important for that question to be asked. So simple thing about causation, right? So you're driving a vehicle, you hit somebody. Who's responsible? You're responsible. The legal system is designed that way, and we are able to point to the driver and say, that person was driving the vehicle, and so this person is responsible, right? The entire system is designed in that way, which is we look at causal links in terms of things, right? The challenge with some of these issues become, and you're right in saying that self-driving cars will probably reduce the number of incidents in drunk driving, driving while intoxicated, and other forms of ways. The challenge still becomes, at some point, is who is responsible? You see, meaning, do owners still have the agency? You see, or they transfer all the agency of responsibility to the software or to algorithms? Meaning, that's a question for civic society to decide. It's not that we would have solved a problem, but we need to ask the problem to be able to design better products. So the only function of raising such illustrations is to say that these could be the challenges. Let's start thinking about what are the possible solutions. That is not to say that you will come up with a solution.
Yes, sir, one more question. Like, I would love to hear scenario where an ethical point of view, or like the ethical framework was incorporated in a product and it made the product better. Like, the question I'm asking is because the ethical questions are so difficult to answer, since they don't have a particular answer, it is difficult to incorporate them into a product.
So this is I think the challenge. You know, this is the challenge, is that it's not a question of whether ethical questions are difficult, and because it is difficult, we should not dive into it. Okay? We should not even say that because ethical questions have been raised for thousands of years and there hasn't been single solution around it, that we should be dismissive of it. Okay? The challenge becomes is that, you know, in the advent of social media and so on, for example, the questions that we are raising is particular to technology design. It's particular to that issue. Okay? It becomes a question for designers on that. But since you asked the question about a product, you know, if you have done the latest update on your Apple iOS devices, you see, one of the simple things, one of the simple tweaks that the latest update does is it tells you how much screen time on what kind of app you're spending. Okay? That's ethical framing. Okay? That's ethical framing around the idea that which gives users a sense of awareness around whether you're storytelling yourself that I'm spending more time on the phone doing productivity, or whether you're spending time on entertainment. So even having ethical framing to give clarity to users, to say that you're spending 2 hours on emails or 5 hours on Instagrams and 5 hours on Facebook, it then allows users to regulate how it is that they're going to interact with devices. So that's one of the concrete examples.
Hello, my question is...
One second. We request the audience to stick to one question each person, following the ethics and empathy.
As earlier man has clearly suggested, this following of ethics, you know, from time immemorial, right from Aristotle, it is coming and it is going to come also in the future. And also if you talk about the ethics aspect, driverless car, you know, according to me, it is not suitable for our country like India, because we are unethical if we introduce that driverless technology in our country. But what I'm trying to say is, the ethics, empathy and technology, all these things are fine. And you can do even PhD on ethics. But only thing is, people must be trained to be ethical. You should be more on practical aspects, right. And the transformation must be inside. And according to me, and according to Indian ethos, if you are in tune with nature, if you are doing right type of introspection, you will automatically become ethical, and the focus must be on in that aspect, not on studying or theories. What do you say about it?
You see, I'm a big fan of ethical training. Okay? So the idea is that people should train and change. I'm not a big fan of just storytelling. Okay? The thing is that we confuse ourselves. We are masters of self-deception as humans. You see? We confuse ourselves, in things. So yesterday we were having some conversation around religion and ethics, for example. That, if you take a poll around people and you say, "Are you ethical?" most people will say yes. If you take a poll and say, "Are you kind?" most people will say yes. Right? Because they have rationalized the idea to a certain degree, how they're honest, how they're ethical, how they're kind, and so on. Right? But if you look at the behavioral aspect of how a society functions, even in something like religious worship, right? What does an average Indian do when they go to temple? You see? An average Indian negotiates when they go into temple. You see? If you actually look at the act of worship, right, they are negotiating. They're negotiating with the divine, saying, "Give me this, and in turn, I'll become your devotee, or I'll give you this, and I'll give you that." Meaning it's an act of negotiation. It's not an act of worship, but we have rationalized that because we are religious, this act of worship is justifiable. You see? This is the challenge, you see, is that our brain fools us. We have become masters of self-deception. Okay? So to constantly evoke the idea that, well, this has always existed in Indian society, and this has always existed in Indian ethos and so on, the question that I'm raising today is, where is it today? Where is it in education system? You see? Where is it in your classrooms? Where is it in the workplace? Right? Then the question around whether it's applicable to India or not is a secondary question. When you're designing technology, and because this talk is about technology, when you're designing technology, you're not just designing for Indian market. You're not just designing, most people today are designing technology for a global market. Okay? So you can't just, there will be cultural, nation-specific issues around it. Okay? But I don't think individuals will start thinking about dismissing the ethical framing of things. That's where we are lacking. Okay? And the second part we are lacking is where we go into this rationalization mode that, oh, we are already ethical. Okay? Because practically the issue becomes, how often are we able to manifest ethical decision making in our lives? Okay? When given the opportunity to choose between ethical decision making and unethical decision making. That's where the thing is.
Due to paucity of time, we will take 2 more questions.
Okay, hi. Hi. As one of the faculty who teaches a compulsory course on professional ethics, and students, some of them say they don't find value because some of the classes become very preachy. How would you recommend us to go about teaching such a large class?
Don't preach. Don't preach. Lecturing on ethics is a terrible idea. Lecturing on ethics is a terrible idea. See, traditionally, that's what has failed us, I think, because we have stuck to a pedagogy of teaching ethics in a way where we lecture on it. Okay? But what we need to actually promote is a kind of critical thinking, okay? Where we don't walk into the classroom as teachers, as professors, to say, these are the best practices. Okay? Because practices do change. Practices do change with time and culture and so on. Okay? So the best thing we can do is instill a form of critical reflection and critical thinking where people start to converse around what would be most ethical norm in a given society. See? How should we move ahead of this thing? And this is I think is the biggest challenge, is that even institutions that say that, oh, we have courses on values education, or we teach ethics and all these things, the pedagogy is very inadequate. Yeah? And oftentimes, this is one of my challenges with education institutions is, we open up centers of innovation, but educational institutions are the least innovative in themselves. See? Meaning that we design curriculums, but we don't revise it very frequently. See? And I think that's where, again, when we talk about humanities and delivery of ethics, we have to start asking, is it really relevant? And if it's relevant, are the students getting it? Is there a retention level in that?
Excuse me, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, sir. Good evening. From the perspective of an evolutionary timeline, I think right now almost all our laws are human-centric. So is it time that we start talking about the traditional universal laws and the noble laws with the advent of AI?
So the thing is, again, that all I can talk about is human ethics, right? Because as species, that's how we have evolved. Meaning, even when we project ethical framing on animals and ecology and so on, it's very much from the human dimension of things, right? It becomes a crucial question, again, you know, I don't want to start sounding like a futuristic kind of thing, but say if AI does become what it is supposed to become, and we have to treat it as another species, right? The fact is that they're going to be more efficient in most things than we humans are. So one set of premises that we simply accept defeat, and we say humans, we lived our course as a species, we realize we are completely useless, and we just disappear, like most species have disappeared in the past. Right? Or the other aspect of it is that we demonstrate some ability to survive, but then now we are not the most superior species on the planet, intelligence-wise, efficiency-wise, and so on. So then we have to start thinking about what would an interspecies ethics look like. Right? Because we haven't been very good at that either in our own practice of interspecies ethics, right? The way we treat climate, the way we treat animals, and so on. So I think it's an opportunity in that regard. You see? So if you take like the sense of S curve or J curve in evolution, one way to say is, okay, humans are done. So we live our course of life, whatever we need to live, and then we are done. And then whatever species takes over next, that's fine. We go from there. Or the other way is to think about, you know, do we need to reorient our own ethical framing, how we live, how we relate to other species, to see where things will happen more conducively. One of my friends at MIT, who's a brilliant physicist, you know, so we often have these kinds of discussion, and we say, you know, it's about time that humans stopped this carbon chauvinism attitude. You see, that in the evolutionary function of things, that we are the most superior form of carbon probably is going to end very soon.
I now request our respected Professor V. Vijayalakshmi to felicitate the speaker with a memento.
Are we done? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I wish to express our heartfelt gratitude to Mr. Tenzin Priyadarshini for his insightful lecture. Sir, it has been an honor hosting you here today, and I am sure that audience has gathered a lot of knowledge and an inspiration from your talk. I also wish to thank all of those who have contributed towards making this lecture a memorable one. Thank you.